So the next assignment is going to be a continuation of drawing different kinds of spaces, but this time I think it's going to be more logical. It's going to be more familiar to you. The negative space, the layered space was a bit of an experimental stretch, but I think when you think of perspective, when you think of Renaissance art, when you think of the two rails in the railroad tracks going off to the horizon line, meeting at a vanishing point, you know fairly well that this kind of geometric linear perspective is something you see every day, especially in terms of architecture and any kind of geometric subject. So there are basically two kinds of linear perspectives that we're going to be dealing with. The first one is one-point perspective. The second one is two-point perspective. Now with the one-point perspective, everything is rushing towards a single vanishing point. Okay, that's a particular technical term in terms of drawing, whereby all the parallel lines that are moving away from you are heading towards this particular point. And what I've done first off in my paper, which is a little bit bigger than yours, but is not necessarily very different in terms of your construction, is to draw a horizontal line across the paper. I'd say just a little bit less than, a little bit lower than halfway. Okay, I'm going to make it dark. I'm going to put it in. I've got all this stuff floating around here, and I'll explain what that is. But I want to make sure that you understand that this is a starting point in your particular kind of drawing. It would go right across the paper, and somewhere casually, doesn't have to be mathematically, but somewhere casually in the center of that, all the sides of the objects, the parallel horizontal sides of the objects are rushing towards that vanishing point. And that the faces of the objects, the surfaces that are facing you, are, to keep it simple at this point, rectilinear or squarish kinds of forms that are all right angles. And I'm going to reinforce a given form here so you understand logically what's happening. This is a long, skinny, tall rectangle that I'm going to reinforce with a darker line. If you can see that. It's arbitrary. I'm not measuring anything. Just as you draw these things, just as I'm trying to draw these things, you're really after, as best as you can, without a right angle, without a T-square and drafting equipment, get your right angles for the front faces as close to right angles as possible. So I've just drawn this long, could be any kind of rectangle or square, this long vertical rectangle. Now that's going to be a face, a surface that is facing you. Okay. Now I'll draw another one. Well, let's see. I will draw what of course is the most important thing, which is the lines to the corners, the inside corners of that thing, that are coming from the vanishing point. So there's a line that's very important, and we're going to call these lines construction lines or guidelines. Construction lines are cool because they really are structuring the objects that you're drawing. So I've got this front face with right angles, and I've got these lines from the vanishing points going to the inside corners of that square, the left-hand corners of that square. I'm going to cut it off. I'm going to decide that this can't go on forever, this particular cubic form, by putting another vertical line towards its back. But notice that vertical line is cut off by the lines that are coming from the vanishing point. It sounds more complicated than it really is. This is all you need to know, in a sense, to do a complicated and inventive one-point perspective. And indeed, these kinds of drawings that you'll be doing are not going to be observed, not going to be of realistic architecture, but I prefer this in the 1-point and the 2-point homework assignments, that you invent something, that you've sort of come up with a kind of futuristic set of cubic sculptures or cities that are pertaining to the 1-point and 2-point, but out of your head rather than trying to observe something. So very straightforward. I've got this cubic form with its flat right-angled face towards me. Its angles are going to be constructed, its side angles are going to be constructed from the vanishing point to the front face corners, okay, top and bottom. And then, since it can't go on forever, you've got to cut it off at some point. It could bring it back to this point, but I chose to sort of cut it off right there. So in terms of principle, in terms of the technique that you're going to be using, I'll make this even darker. This is all you really need to know about the basics of one-point perspective. Now, a general issue when you're talking about things in one and two-point perspective, but here's one-point perspective, is that with the horizon line being in a certain position, those things that are below it are going to be showing their upper portions, and those things above it are going to be showing their lower portions. So, you're looking up at an object, you're going to see the bottom. You're looking down at an object, you're going to see its top. And very strange things, or at least different things, happen when you get close to the vanishing point itself, above or below. For instance, this particular cubic form here, and I'll just reinforce it, this particular cubic form here, face towards us, and vanishing point lines going to the central vanishing point, like this and this, that particular object would show its bottom, but not the two sides. You're not going to see a side to the left or right. It's going to have just two faces because it's so close to this center line above or below the vanishing point. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. You're not doing it incorrectly if you just see two faces in this central vertical area above and below the vanishing point. Okay? We all know glass prisms from science class. Their shape is triangular, but the triangular shape becomes a kind of bar, a kind of three-sided planar figure, that volumetric figure that goes back in space. So what I've done here, you can arbitrarily put any kind of triangle facing us. It works a little bit better if it's an equilateral or an isosceles triangle. Remember from high school that equilateral was an equal-sided, three-sided triangle, equal three sides. Isosceles was two sides. Doesn't really matter. You could sort of wing it by a casually symmetrical triangle. I happen to have built a square and done a halfway point through the square with diagonals, and then found a place along here to make the size of the triangle project. So if you've got any kind of sort of symmetrical triangle up front here, you then, instead of having these sides from cubes going back to the vanishing point, you are taking the vanishing point and meeting the corners of the triangle. 1, 2, and 3. And where you want to terminate or end the triangle is up to you, but I would not send it too far back. And if this line here, eye it with a ruler. You could measure, I suppose, or you could use a ruler and just get a parallel line that's farther down. Point is that this line and this line, this first face here, should be parallel to the line that you do down here. And one easy way to do that is to take the width of the ruler and do it, as I think I did in the beginning, for this one here. So basically this and this are parallel. So you can see, because it's rising above and flying above the horizon line, you have two sides of this prismatic form that becomes an interesting and much more varied form to throw in here. Now, along with the issue of above and below the vanishing point, we did talk about how with the prism or with these sculptural forms you can add some variety to your constructions. And one of the varieties you can add to your constructions are cylinders. All right, here's a prism, here's a L shape that's irregular, and to to do a cylinder, if indeed in one point perspective the flat-on faces are as you see them full, then a cylinder is going to display a circle. So if you want to start out with a kind of flat-faced form for a cylinder, fine. If you have a compass, fine. If you have that kind of flexibility, fine. But if you have any kind of around the kitchen caps, cans, circles, reasonably sized so that you don't have a huge drawing here, you can use them to trace onto the paper, and then from there send back lines, the tops and the bottoms of the cylinder, to go to the singular vanishing point that is in our one-point perspective. So darken this one here and redarken this one here, so that there you're talking about, and you're dealing with something of a more interesting form. It becomes so much less complicated than in your cubic form, because you've just got this rounded face that goes back to the vanishing point. And how do you cut it off? Well, you can't simply do this. You can't simply take this circle and move it back there. You have to find another circle that would fit between a smaller portion of the two projected lines to the vanishing point. So I've got this good old medicine cap here that happens to be a little bit smaller, and I'm going to trace it, but only on this part of the cylinder. You don't, unless you have kind of glass cylinder or kind of translucent cylinder where you want to see the full circle. I think it relates to the other forms, which are sort of solid and opaque. Relates to the other forms better if you just do a kind of smallish circle that is farther back in the width of this diminishing set of construction lines that go back to the vanishing point. Here I've done one with perhaps the cap, medicine cap again, and I've used either a dime or a nickel, I think a dime here, to cut it off farther back so that you have a longer cylinder. The smaller the circle you're tracing for the distant edge. And a word about how you compose this stuff. So up front, far away, have things radiate around, and even, as I'll reinforce this one here, if I can do it up here, there's one here that's this kind of narrow cubic form that's actually, and this is a great compositional thing, it becomes much more of an active composition if you do this, where the form is actually going outside the paper. It's like you've got an active space with things flying and floating in a way that that's not confined. It's like you've got a window on another world that has many more interesting shapes flying and floating. So in the end, you'll have a composition that might look a little bit sci-fi, might look like some futuristic floating city. Okay, the varied shapes you can get in terms of the cylinders or the triangles, or the prismatic triangles, or the irregular shapes that might be bent and turned and jutted in different angles. That those will all give you a more interesting composition. And one other small thing that you don't really have to follow to the nth degree, but you might keep in mind, that basically those things that are coming forward toward you are going to be a little bit more defined and incisive and crisp. Okay, I'm not asking you to shade these things. If you really feel you've had a lot of experience with this stuff and can figure out in your imagination where the light source is from and where cast shadows might go, that's fine. But I think my basic objective is to introduce you to the 1 and 2 point perspective. So linear construction is fine, but the linear construction can be something more than just a solid weight line that's even all over. And I'm going to try to find one here. Maybe this small cylinder that's down here. If I were to make this cylinder seem like it's coming forward in space a lot more powerfully, a lot more strongly than with just an even weighted line all around its contours, I would try to make that form that is up front, make that in this case circle, that is the front face of it, fairly dark, fairly dark. I mean, I'm going to freehand it so that this looks fairly dark. Okay? And what that does perceptually and illusionistically is it brings things forward. And if you were to take that principle to the two sides with a ruler and have the up front edge that's against the circle as dark as the circle, but then sort of fade, okay, going away, then sort of fade, going toward the back, and you can play this game with your kneaded eraser as well. If things can gradually get crisp up front, faded in the back, you can see how that would work on the larger shapes and shapes as they go back in space to give you an added dimension to the distance. That's not all that important, okay? But if you feel you know this stuff fairly well, it comes easily to you, or you've learned it fairly quickly, if you're confident, okay, no matter what your experience, if you're confident in this stuff, chase the different weights of outlines. We're about to go on to a two-point perspective demonstration, and they're very related, 1 and 2 points. In this one here, we're talking about objects radiating from a single point on a horizon line or an eye level, and that each of the front faces, and indeed they're front faces, they're shapes that are facing the picture plane, each of them, if it's a square or rectangle, are right angles or a pure circle. They are a triangle that's flat on. In other words, all the faces that are coming towards us in a one-point perspective are flat onto the picture plane and directly in our face in terms of our perception. The difference with two-point perspective is that, not too hard to comprehend, but you've got things at an angle. They're still cubistic, they're still rectilinear, we're still talking about right-angled things. But instead of starting with, say, a square, or even a circle, or a rectangle or a triangle, we're starting with a given corner of an object, okay? All the corners are facing us, and all the side lines are going back to two vanishing points, which will be on a horizon line similar to this one. It might be a little bit lower in the 2-point if you want it outdoors, but I've got a horizon line that has a vanishing point to the left and right, and from those two you're going to radiate lines that connect to that corner, vertical corner of an object that in this case is flying or floating in space. So let's concentrate on this object here, okay? Let's concentrate on this sort of cubic thing flying. It is situated so that you can see its bottom, okay? You're looking up at it because it is above the horizon line, the eye level. You see these down here, this one down here especially, you can see its top because it is below that eye level or vanishing point. So let's get to the simplest thing to construct right here. I'm going to, these things have been drawn somewhat prior to this, and I'm going to go over them, reinforcing them with darker lines as I'm telling you about how it's done. So I'm drawing a vertical here, and on your blank paper when you're starting out, you will do just that. And since you don't have right triangles, drafting tables, and T-squares and all sorts of drafting instruments, just do the best you can to get it as a perpendicular line to the sides of the paper. Okay. Same with the 1-point perspective. You're really trying to do as best you can make right angles as the faces are facing. So I've got this overdone corner here that is very dark, and to its bottom and top, I'm going to send a construction line that becomes its actual bottom edge with a darker line. Okay? Same with the top. It's on the left face, it's on the left side of that corner, so a radiating line from the vanishing point to the top edge of this cubic form becomes dark. I'm going to make the back edge a little bit darker. So although these objects are pretty defined in this drawing I'm showing you right now, you would begin to construct an object floating in space by doing, again, a corner that is closest to you, okay? Radiating lines first from or to the left-hand vanishing point. Same with this side here. I'm going to radiate lines from the vanishing point to the top of that cubic form and darken them so you can see them. And do the same to the bottom. Here. And then just as I've done on this side, to terminate, to stop the, to give an end to this cubic form, I'm going to do one here that defines its depth, defines its back edge. And I'm going to just erase a little bit this too dark line right here. And like you did in your first one, as we did in the first one rather, you know, if you can keep your quote-unquote construction lines fairly light, in other words, have them there, have them visible, but the very lines that are the edges of the forms, those want to be dark. And so don't erase your construction lines in the end, okay? Keep them in, but make them fainter than the final lines that are the actual edges of objects in the two-point perspective. Well, we made a little bit of adjustment in terms of the angle of the shot because for this video we're using an iPad as opposed to an iPhone, which has had technical problems. So bear with us and remember that I have been, whatever you've been seeing to this point, I have been talking about the two-point perspective forms having vertical edges which are closest to, which are pointing at, which are on the side of our viewing, okay, to the picture plane. On the one-point perspective, as we seen before, you've got flat faces of squares and circles and triangles that are coming toward you. Here, you just have this edge. And from the top and bottoms of those edges, you're drawing lines to the vanishing point. So I'm going to complete this cubic form using the right-hand vanishing point to close off that form and this form here. So this is, in some ways, what I've just done is the basic geometric principle of two-point perspective. Edges are closest to you, sides are projected back to the left and right vanishing point. If things are above the horizon line or eye level, if it's an interior, you see their bottoms. If they are below that line, okay, you see their tops. So the other thing that you can work on with your imaginary homework two-point perspective is, just as we talked about in the one-point perspective, making some forms a little more unexpectedly irregular. I've had students do interesting cubic and geometric forms of letters, T's, W's, any kind of block lettering would work in this. It gets a little bit complicated, but you're welcome to get that complex. But basically, it's fairly easy to make a projection or two of moderately complicated things by starting out with your closest edge, imagining that it has, you know, a kind of vertical width like this, and for this little projection up top, okay, I've simply, you know, gone off to the right-hand vanishing point and pulled a line out to get this form, this edge and the others are fairly dark. So I can just reinforce this a little bit, and you'll see that you have a kind of upside down, longish, boxy L. Here, there, again, bottom edge because it's above the horizon line. Back edge here, going back to the right hand vanishing point. Okay, doesn't quite fit, but does there now. Okay, and there you go. Now, one thing I want to, this is a strange and distorted prismatic form, much like trying to be the one that, much like the one that was in the 1-point perspective. In 2-point perspective, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So I would avoid, unless you're really ambitious and can check some things online, any prismatic sorts of forms in the 2-point perspective. That's up to you. One thing I want to press that I didn't really deal in the 1-point perspective, and it's in a sense useful in both 1- and 2-point perspectives, is the fact that you can break up a form. You can divide it evenly by diagonals. Okay, this pre-done thing here, this grid here, was done on this face of the box by first doing diagonals from the corners and getting a kind of center crosshair, and I just kept going with diagonals and making more lines, which made for a more complex grid. I can show you more clearly from the start if I tried one on this face. Okay, here I have a rectangle hovering in space and is foreshortened. Okay, that's the fancy art word that means it gets slimmer and narrower and smaller as it goes back in space. So there I have diagonals that give me the center. So to see the relationship of something flat onto you, like a square, or something close to a square, and finding the center of that, you've got fairly easy logic of diagonals finding the center of the square, flat on. These guys are right angles. However, if you have a form that is in perspective, going to a vanishing point, either 1 or 2 vanishing points, you are dealing with the same geometry but at an angle, and you can really play a game, finding out the true center of something that's foreshortened by taking this angled form, this trapezoid really, and doing diagonals just as you would do in the flat-on square. And if you were to run a vertical through this, okay, if you were to run a vertical through this, you would have a line that would be halfway across that square, but it would be foreshortened. It would be larger in the front part, half, and smaller in the second half. Okay, just as railroad ties get closer as you go off into the distance, just as things get compressed, telephone poles get compressed on a straight highway going off in the distance, so these things would diminish. But one of the ways to play with that is to take in even gestures to one half then the other, and just keep breaking it up evenly. You have the ability to do forms that geometrically, accurately diminish in their widths by using the diagonals. Not that you have to do this to an elaborate degree, but it would be nice to take a form take an edge, a face, in one of your pieces, and to, with diagonals, play a game of dividing it. So I've got this face here. I'm doing a vertical halfway point. Now, when it comes to the horizontal halfway point, you can't just do it across like that, right? Because this is at an angle. So where are we going to, how are we going to construct that line? From the given vanishing point in which this surface is facing. So it's up to the right-hand vanishing point. We're going to put it through the center, and you've got that kind of division, okay? We needn't do it more complicated. I had done one here in a more complicated way, so you can get up to, with fairly easy repetitions, you could get up to 16 breakups of a rectangle through repetitive diagonals. But that's just to show you how, in perspective, things get foreshortened at a regular rate. And the regular rate you can play with is by dividing the rectangles in perspective, dividing them into with diagonals that find progressively different center points through here. So I think what I've not got in this one here, and what I think I may try to put in from scratch, would be a form that would be across the horizon line. In other words, I've segregated these guys, so that they're either below or above, okay? And what happens with an edge? What happens with a line that is constructed across the vanishing point? Because certainly something can stand in your field of vision, blocking out a bit of the horizon or the your eye level. So here's an imaginary edge that's towards us. Here's a construction line that would give us the proper angle. Okay, and I'm going to make it small so it doesn't get disappeared behind this thing here. Do this, this, this. So there I've got one narrow face of a box that's heading, it's angled toward the left-hand vanishing point. Okay? Very simple. You want it to be complete with a side to the right of the edge. So do that. Do that. And very easily cut it off at a given depth. Do that. Okay. Darken the lines so that hopefully you can see them. So there you've got a cubic form, just invented proportions, okay? But it's sitting in front of the horizon line, and therefore, unlike these guys, where you can see their bottoms, unlike these guys, where you can see their tops, since the top and the bottom are invisible because it sits across the eye level, you end up with a form that only has two drawn sides. We know that it has four, okay? But we can see only two of those sides because it is in front of the horizon line and the eye level. So as noted in your text with this assignment, you're going to be doing two drawings, one point, the other 2 point. And I would spend as much time as you need, and on small papers do practice drawings with vanishing points that might be closer together if it's 2 points, with a vanishing point that's off to one side if it's 1 point. In other words, get the hang of things. And even if you start a big one and it doesn't quite work out, just simply reconstruct and learn and evolve and get down the technique so that you can do things that seem to look accurate. So the bottom line is to demonstrate the technique of 1 and 2 point perspective. The artful thing, the more hard to talk about and hard to dictate to you, would be to make it interesting, to make things fly and float. I don't really have it here, but some of them at one point overlap to one another, so that you have a kind of active, interesting, gravity defying set of cubic forms that are flying and floating. Okay, and you'll find that if you get too close to the edge of the paper, if you try to do forms that are too close to the vanishing point, I'm just going to do one here, they become extremely, I'm just going to do a kind of plane, a side of something that's fairly close to the vanishing point. And the closer you get to that vanishing point, the more severe, the more narrow, the more extreme the angle, okay, of the form, so that you end up with forms that look like this. They're not incorrect, but when you get very close to the vanishing point, you're really getting close to the periphery of your vision, in a sense. You're really getting close to the edge of what you can see, and the distortion that happens there, like a fisheye lens, becomes a little bit unreal. There you can see something that may look real to you, but if it were even closer, you could see how it becomes like a blade, a knife blade, so narrow with angles top and bottom that are going to be so extreme that they become very unreal. So while I'm asking you to be creative about the composition, don't get too close. Don't get too close to the left and right vanishing point. You can go up and down fairly comfortably and realistically. You can come out to the sides a bit, but get inventive, get creative. It's that old art problem of trying to possess and use and know the system, yet be creative and sort of intuitive and unpredictable in what you do with it.